Wind moves differently in northern Scotland. It doesn't just pass over the hills, it lingers, it circles, it presses against the earth as if trying to remember something. And in that landscape stand stones, tall, silent, carved. Across the Highlands and the Northeast, in Aberdeenshire, Moray, Angus, and Perth, ancient monoliths rise from the soil. Their surfaces are etched with strange figures, beasts with unnatural curves, double discs connected by bars, spears, mirrors, combs, symbols repeated but never explained. For nearly 2,000 years they have stood there, and no one has ever definitively deciphered them. Most of these stones date between the 6th and 9th centuries AD. The carvings are not crude. The lines are deliberate. Proportions are balanced. Many designs show mirror symmetry, executed with geometric precision. Whoever made them was not experimenting. They were following rules. But what rules? When scholars in the 19th century first began systematically studying these stones, they assumed the obvious answer. This must be writing, a lost script, the remains of a vanished people. Victorian researchers measured the carvings, sketched them, cataloged them. Publications described them as relics of a prehistoric race. The name attached to them was already circulating in medieval chronicles: the Picts, a people described as mysterious, painted, fierce, and conveniently gone. Some historians claimed they migrated from distant lands. Others argued they arrived suddenly and disappeared just as suddenly. A civilization that left only stone behind. It was a powerful story, but it was built on almost nothing. Archaeology in the 19th century was obsessed with texts. If symbols existed, they had to be language. If language existed, it had to belong to a distinct people. And if that people left no readable records, they must have vanished. The stones were treated like pages torn from a lost book. But there was a problem. The symbols do not behave like writing. By the late 20th century, researchers had to admit something uncomfortable. These carvings do not form sentences. They don't show grammatical patterns. They don't repeat in ways consistent with alphabets. Yet they are not random. Certain symbols always appear together. Others are restricted to specific regions. Some combinations repeat along ancient routeways, especially near rivers and territorial boundaries. These were not words, they were markers, recognition, not reading, which raises a deeper question. If the symbols were never a foreign script, then who exactly were the people carving them? For centuries, the answer was myth. But in the early 21st century, something changed. The stones were no longer the only source of evidence. Science found another archive, not carved in rock, stored in bone. Long before DNA entered the conversation, the story of the Picts was shaped by rumor. Medieval chroniclers described them as a people who came from afar, perhaps from across the North Sea, perhaps from distant coasts no one could clearly name. The accounts were vague, contradictory, written centuries after the events they claimed to describe, but they had impact. As European national histories formed, the idea of a mysterious incoming people fit perfectly. Strange symbols, foreign origin. Unfamiliar art style, migration. No surviving language, extinction. The name itself seemed to support the myth. Pict was linked to the Latin picti, meaning painted or colored. Roman writers had used it for tribes north of Hadrian's Wall. From that, an image grew, tattooed warriors emerging from northern mist, separate from everyone else on the island. By the 19th century, this image hardened into academic theory. Archaeology was still young. Written sources were treated as authority. So when stones covered with unfamiliar carvings were found across northeastern Scotland, they were interpreted as proof of a distinct race, disconnected from the rest of Britain. Some scholars argued the Picts came from Scandinavia. Others proposed northern Europe. A few suggested eastern continental origins, claiming the symbols were brought through ancient trade routes. The logic felt convincing. After all, the carvings did not resemble typical Celtic knotwork. They did not match Roman inscriptions. They stood apart visually, and difference was interpreted as foreignness. But beneath the surface, the material record told a quieter story. Weapons found in the same regions did not look imported. Ornaments resembled those of neighboring communities. Burial practices
practices aligned with local traditions. There was no dramatic break in tools, pottery, or settlement patterns. If a new people had arrived, they left almost no archaeological trace of disruption. By the mid-20th century, British archaeology began to reconsider. Researchers started treating Pictish culture as part of a broader historical continuum rather than an isolated anomaly. The idea of total disappearance began to weaken, yet the myth persisted. Textbooks still described the Picts as enigmatic outsiders. Popular history loved the mystery. A vanished people is far more dramatic than a continuous one.
So, a contradiction lingered. Archaeology suggested continuity, legend insisted on rupture, and there was still no direct proof of origin. For centuries, scholars tried to read answers from stone. They were looking in the wrong archive, because while archaeologists debated symbols, another field was quietly developing tools capable of answering a different question. Not what the Picts carved, but who they actually were. In the early 21st century, that question finally moved from theory to laboratory, and what scientists found did not support the ghost story. It dismantled it. In the early 21st century, the breakthrough did not come from a newly discovered stone. It came from bone. Archaeologists had excavated human remains in northeastern Scotland, individuals who lived during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. This was crucial. It placed them centuries before most surviving symbol stones, which date between the 6th and 9th centuries AD. If these were the ancestors of the Pictish carvers, genetics could finally test the migration theory. Extracting ancient DNA is not simple. After 1,500 years or more, genetic material is fragile, fragmented, easily contaminated. Scientists work in sterile clean rooms with filtered air. Tools are treated with ultraviolet light. Even breathing near samples can compromise results. From teeth and dense bone tissue, they isolate microscopic traces of preserved genetic material. The DNA survives only in short fragments, millions of broken pieces. Those fragments are sequenced and digitally reassembled using computational algorithms, like reconstructing a burned manuscript from scattered ash. It is slow, technical, precise, but the results were clear. When those genomes were compared to other ancient samples across Britain, they showed continuity, not invasion. The individuals from northeastern Scotland were genetically similar to Iron Age populations already living on the island. There was no sign of a sudden influx from Scandinavia, no clear marker of continental replacement, no abrupt population break. The people associated with early Pictish culture were local, descendants of communities that had occupied the region for generations, even millennia. Further analysis revealed regional variation. Samples from mainland northeastern Scotland differed slightly from those in places like Orkney, but variation is not migration. It reflects local development within a shared genetic framework. This was the critical shift. The Picts were not foreign race that arrived and vanished. They were part of the continuous human story of Scotland. They did not disappear. They merged, adapted, evolved alongside neighboring groups. Their genes did not vanish. They were passed forward. The ghost people narrative collapsed under molecular evidence, and with that collapse came a new problem. If the Picts were not outsiders, if their ancestry was local, then their symbols were not imported mysteries either. They were expressions of something that had grown from the land itself. The stones had to be reconsidered, not as relics of a lost civilization, but as messages from a society deeply rooted in its own soil. And that changed everything. Once DNA removed the illusion of foreignness, the stones demanded a new reading. If the Picts were local, descendants of Iron Age communities, then their symbols were not borrowed scripts. They were not fragments of a lost alphabet carried across the sea. They were something else. Researchers returned to the landscape itself. Most symbol stones are not randomly placed. They stand near rivers, along routeways, at territorial edges, places where movement slows, where people gather, where boundaries matter. These are not isolated monuments. They are positioned with intention, and the symbols behave in patterns.
The early 21st century studies of remains from northeastern Scotland did more than settle a migration debate. They demonstrated that the past leaves biological traces even when cultural explanations collapse. The Picts were not erased, they were absorbed. Over time, political identities shift. Names disappear, kingdoms merge. By the 9th century AD, Pictish territories blended into what would become medieval Scotland. The label faded, but the population did not. Genes continued, communities evolved. The narrative of disappearance was a misunderstanding born from silence in written sources. Genetics filled that silence, and in doing so, it reframed the stones themselves. No longer relics of an extinct race, no longer fragments of an unsolved cipher imported from elsewhere. They became something more intimate, evidence of a society negotiating identity, authority, lineage, and memory within its own homeland. The carvings from the 6th to 9th centuries AD were not the final words of a dying culture. They were expressions of continuity, of people deeply embedded in the landscape of northern Scotland. Farmers, craftspeople, warriors, families, ordinary human lives once mythologized into something spectral. The irony is striking. For centuries, scholars searched for exotic origins, Scandinavia, continental Europe, distant migrations. The truth was quieter, more grounded, less dramatic. The Picts did not arrive from nowhere. They had always been there. Their story did not end in disappearance. It dissolved into continuity. Today, every time those stones are studied, whether through archaeological survey, surface scanning, or genomic sequencing, they speak again, not in the language of riddles, but in the language of evidence. The symbols remain undeciphered in the traditional sense. We may never translate them into sentences, but perhaps that was never their purpose. They were not designed for future scholars to decode like an alphabet. They were designed for communities to recognize themselves. And thanks to DNA, we now recognize them too, not as a ghost people, not as a vanished race, but as part of the long, unbroken human story of Scotland. The stones still stand in the wind. Only now we understand that they were never markers of disappearance. They were markers of belonging. And that may be the most powerful rewrite of all.